Homeschooling in Ontario, how it works and how to get started. Hello everyone, my name is Marian Buchanan and I'm with the Ontario Federation of Teaching Parents, OFTP. Our motto is, you can educate your child at home. And what that means is, first of all, that it's legal. And secondly, you can do this. It's just an extension of the parenting you're already doing. Everything you need to know about homeschooling in Ontario is right on our website at ontariohomeschool.org. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of it right now in this video. So let's start with the legalities. As you may know, every province has its own laws and regulations about education, and of course homeschooling is included in that. In Ontario, we have the Education Act and Policy Program Memorandum Number 131, PPM 131 for short. One thing I want to stress is that the part of it that's the law is the Education Act, and PPM 131 is just a policy. Policies are just guidelines for how to implement legislation, but they're not legislation themselves. So anything that's in the Education Act is legally enforceable and overrides anything that's at odds with it in the policy. So what does the law say about homeschooling? It's in subsection 21(2)(a). A person is excused from attendance at school if the person is receiving satisfactory instruction at home or elsewhere. Notice that it doesn't say anything about needing to get permission from anyone or even needing to notify anyone. It just says a person is excused if the person is receiving satisfactory instruction. Satisfactory instruction is not defined in the Education Act. It's also not defined in the policy. Now, there is some wording in the policy that's relevant, and we'll talk about that when we get to talking about investigations. But for now, the point is that under normal circumstances, subsection 21(2)(a) is, in and of itself, your legal permission to homeschool without any prior steps of approval or notification. Now here's what the policy says, in other words, what the ministry wants parents to do. Parents who decide to provide homeschooling for their children should notify the school board of their intent in writing. Keep in mind, this is not a request for permission, it's a notification of your parental decision. You do it in writing so that there's a record of it. It's called the letter of intent. Sending a letter of intent is just common sense when you're withdrawing a child from the school system. Like if your child has been attending school or is registered to attend, you need, of course, to let the school know that they won't be attending after all, and so you do need to notify them. And it makes sense to do it in writing because that documents your communication, so you should keep a copy for yourself. The policy asks you to send the letter of intent to the school board, but we recommend you also send a copy to the school itself so that they're in the loop about what's happening and they know your child is legally excused, they're not just truant. But if your child has not been attending school and not been registered to attend, then you can choose not to send a letter of intent before you're asked for one. Because remember, this is just a policy, not the law, and the law doesn't say anything at all about having to notify anybody. The policy also directs parents to send a letter of intent every year as long as they're still homeschooling. But once again, this is not necessary. It goes beyond what's required by law, and the only reason you might need to do it is if you need a reply letter from the school board as part of an application for other services that want official verification of your homeschooling status. There aren't many services like that. The main one is the Independent Learning Center, the ILC, which is an online high school credit course provider, and homeschoolers sometimes use that to get an OSSD. Another one that often asks for a school board letter is the School Health Support Services, for access to things like speech pathology or other special needs services that the SHSS covers. Mind you, if you're willing to stand up for your right to get the health services without the letter from the school board, there are precedents for that. Some families have insisted on their legal rights to access and have gone up the chain of command, and they've ultimately been granted services without the school board letter. If you do need a reply letter from the school board, you may want to ask for it explicitly when you send in your letter of intent, because some school boards don't bother sending a reply in writing. And actually that fact might help to make it really sink in that this is indeed just a policy, and not even the school boards follow it to the letter all the time. So that should reassure you that you're not breaking the law if you don't follow the policy, like if you don't send a letter of intent when you don't need to. Now, one good thing about PPM 131 is that it explicitly revokes the previous policy, the Johnson Memorandum. And what that does is revoke routine monitoring or routine investigation of homeschoolers. So PPM 131 tells school boards to accept a letter of intent as evidence that the parents are providing satisfactory instruction and not to investigate the matter under normal circumstances. So how does it work if you don't send a letter of intent? Well, the same principles still apply. The law itself is what gives you permission to homeschool. There's still no school board approval or notification required by law. And just because the school board doesn't know about your homeschooling doesn't make it illegal. If they find out about it, they're most likely going to want a letter of intent, and you can give it to them at that time. Now, if you were to refuse to send a letter of intent after they contacted you to ask for one, then they might think there was something suspicious going on and they might try to investigate. Because the policy does suggest that there are situations where a school board might think that they have a good reason to investigate. So this would be a non-routine investigation, something about your situation that's raising flags for them. And it's supposed to be based on, quote-unquote, reasonable grounds to be concerned that the instruction provided in the home may not be satisfactory. Now remember, we're still talking about the policy here. School board investigations are not part of the law, they're just part of the policy. So if you ever find yourself in that situation where the school board is trying to investigate your homeschooling, the first thing to do is to get in touch with us at OFTP before you respond or do anything else, and we'll help you reply or reply on your behalf. This is one of the ways we help protect your rights and the rights of the entire homeschooling community. Part of how we do that is to remind them of the part of the policy that's under the heading Guidelines for Conducting an Investigation. It says, board officials should recognize that the methodology, materials, schedules, and assessment techniques used by parents who provide homeschooling may differ from those used by educators in the school system. And then it explicitly says, for example, the parent may not be following the Ontario curriculum, using standard classroom practices in the home, or teaching within the standard school day or school year. And then it tells school boards that in trying to determine whether instruction is satisfactory, they should focus on whether there's a plan for educating the child, in particular, a plan for literacy and numeracy. So this wording is somewhat helpful in getting school officials and school board officials to recognize that their way is not the only way to educate a child and that homeschooling doesn't necessarily look like institutional education. It's something we can quote when we need to remind them of that, which we do when we challenge their need to investigate. If the school board persists in trying to investigate and you're still exercising your right not to cooperate with an investigation that's not described in the Education Act, they have the option to escalate it to the ministry. The Education Act has a very explicit procedure to be followed in cases where a parent's decision to homeschool might be challenged. It's in Section 24(2) of the Act. It starts out by saying, where the parent or guardian of a child considers that the child is excused from attendance at school under subsection 21(2), and the school attendance counselor is of the opinion that the child should not be excused from attendance. So the wording is very telling. It basically tells us that the attendance counselor doesn't get to decide that the child is not excused. They only get to challenge the validity of the excusal. It's expressed as a matter of differing opinions between the parents and the attendance counselor about whether Section 21(2) applies to the child's non-attendance. Notice it's not just about subsection 21(2)A, which is the homeschooling part. It's about all of subsection 21(2), which covers other kinds of excused non-attendance as well, such as living too far away from a school. In the case of homeschooling, though, the applicability of 21(2) hinges on whether or not the child is receiving satisfactory instruction. As we saw earlier, satisfactory instruction is not defined, and PPM 131 tells school board officials that the focus should be on whether there's a plan, especially for literacy and numeracy, but that it doesn't have to look like the kind of instruction given in the school system. So when the attendance counselor is of the opinion that the child should not be excused from attendance, what they're supposed to do is make a request for an inquiry from the provincial school attendance counselor. Now the next part includes some very important wording as well when it describes the way the provincial counselor arranges for an inquiry. It says, For such purpose shall appoint one or more persons who are not employees of the board that operates the school that the child has the right to attend. Presumably the law is worded this way so as to ensure a certain degree of impartiality in any investigation into non-attendance. So this is not a local school board investigation like the kind that the policy talks about. This is a hearing, after which the inquiry officers report their findings and recommendations to the provincial school attendance counselor, and that's the person who gets to decide whether a child can continue to be homeschooled or is ordered to attend school. Now that would be a legal order. If you didn't comply with an inquiry order to send your child to school, you could be taken to court for truancy charges. But that result is very unlikely. Even back when inquiries were more common, they often just resulted in an order that the child continue to be excused from attendance. We have a whole webpage on investigations and inquiries, so you can check that out if you want more details. So now that we've covered the legalities, let's look at how to get started homeschooling in Ontario. There are educational decisions to make and practical steps to take. Your first step depends partly on whether or not your child has been registered to attend school. If they haven't, then you can skip to step number 2. If your child has been attending school or is registered to attend, then your first step can be to withdraw them from the school system, which means sending a letter of intent to the school board with a copy to the school, and you keep a copy for yourself. Now, if you have plenty of time to plan ahead, you might decide that your first step before you withdraw your child is to educate yourself more about homeschooling and figure out a few things in terms of what you want to teach and how you want to teach it. But if your child is having a hard time in school and suffering for it, like they're being bullied or feeling too stressed or anxious or depressed, then don't hesitate to make your first step be withdrawing them from the system, even if you have no idea how you're going to go about homeschooling. It's much more important to take care of your child's needs right away, and you can always figure out the rest later. Our whole website will help you do that, as well as our phone and email volunteers. But whether you make it your first step or a later step, if you do send a letter of intent, I recommend you use the sample letter we have on the OFTP website, because it's less confusing than trying to get it from the policy's PDF file of appendices. Their file includes 3 appendices, not just the Appendix B that is the letter of intent. And some people have been confused by that and thought that Appendix D was also part of the letter of intent because it's part of the same PDF file. But Appendix D is actually a detailed questionnaire to be used for investigations, so you definitely don't want to send that one in. You just want to send the simple, basic notification. So we've separated out the sample letter of intent to avoid the confusion, and you can download it all by itself from our website. So aside from deciding whether or not you need a letter of intent and sending it if you do, what else is there to decide and do? Well, the first step in that part of the process would be to figure out what approach you want to take. Keep in mind this is not an irreversible decision, and in fact, we recommend that you adjust as you go along. But you have to start somewhere, right? So you might as well figure out what approach to try first so that you can get the kinds of materials that you need for that method. We have a web page on teaching methods and learning philosophies that will help you sort out what approach seems most aligned with your own beliefs and values and your own educational and parenting goals. Just a quick overview here. You can choose anything from the most structured, standardized institutional approach, using, for instance, the Ontario Curriculum Guidelines, in other words, replicating school at home, to the most free-form, natural, child-led, life-learning approach known as unschooling, or anything in between those 2 poles of the spectrum. There are any number of parent-guided approaches where you either design your own curriculum from scratch, custom-made for your own children, or you adapt an existing one to your own family's needs and interests and abilities. And then there's what's called eclectic homeschooling, where you might be very structured and instructional in some ways or in some subjects, but very free-form and child-led and purely facilitative in others. So once you know what approach you want to try, that's what determines the kind of materials you're going to want to get to implement that. If you're doing school at home, you might want grade-based textbooks and workbooks. If you're following a specific philosophy of learning, like Waldorf or Montessori or Charlotte Mason, then you're going to want resources that match those approaches. And if you're unschooling, then you don't really need to plan ahead of time what to get. You just live your life, use what you've got on hand, and see what interests come up and what you can afford to invest in that interest. So once you've decided on your approach and you've got your resources, then you just go ahead and implement your plan. And then after that, you just adjust as needed. If you find your approach isn't working, try something else. It's one of the main benefits of homeschooling that you can keep adapting your child's education to the child themselves, their own unique needs and abilities, developmental readiness, learning style, and also their own interests, which can change over time too. There are 2 other steps beyond that are optional but recommended. One is to give your child the opportunity for interaction with other kids outside the family, and this can involve either group activities or one-on-one friendships. One way is to sign them up for what would be considered extracurricular activities if they were in school. Sports like baseball or soccer, or artistic programs like dance or music or painting. And another way to be around other kids is through a local homeschool support group. They usually organize field trips and other group activities, and it also serves as a support system for you as the parent. And finally, the last optional step is to help protect your rights. One way to do that is join the OFTP. When you become a member of OFTP, you get a few personal benefits, like a membership card that can be used for getting educator discounts at stores that offer them. And you get our newsletter, as well as access to back issues. And we also now have a members Facebook group. But one of the main reasons for joining is to support and strengthen the work that OFTP does on behalf of homeschooling families across the province. For one thing, your membership enables OFTP to be a collective voice for the homeschooling community in Ontario. It also adds to our numbers, which increases our clout to have an impact when we need one, like we did when we helped to get the policy changed. And the membership fees pay for the cost of keeping our website and phone line up and running. If you've ever called us or used our website to find information on homeschooling, you've already taken advantage of a lot of what we have to offer, and you know how valuable that is. So we hope you'll support us, because we're here to support you. Feel free to get in touch with any questions you have that aren't answered on our website, and we'll be right there with you, helping you navigate this journey of homeschooling in Ontario.